It was a sweltering August evening in '94 when 10-year-old Emily Garrison stepped out of Maple Hollow's tiny brick church. Her Bible school coloring still clutched in one hand and began her half-mile walk home. She never made it. The street she walked was quiet, safe, the kind of street where kids rode bikes until dusk and neighbors left their doors unlocked. But somewhere between the front steps of that church and her family's driveway, Emily vanished without a sound, without a witness. 2 days later, her backpack was discovered in a shallow creek, waterlogged but eerily intact. No torn straps, no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no Emily. The town of Maple Hollow froze in time. For weeks, people searched the woods, drained ponds, questioned strangers. A white pickup truck had been seen circling the church that evening, but it disappeared as quickly as the leads. And for 27 years, the trail stayed cold until 2021, when a single beer can found near that same creek back in '94 was retested using a brand new forensic method. One that didn't just find a suspect, it found a family tree. The truth that finally emerged didn't just shock Maple Hollow, it shattered it. Why did it take nearly 3 decades to crack the case? And how close had the killer really been this whole time? If stories like this grip you like they do me, hit that like so more true crime lovers can find it. Comment where you're watching from. You're part of this true crime family. Now, subscribe. It fuels this channel to bring you more stories just like this one. To understand what really happened that day, we need to go back to where it all began. August 16, '94 was the kind of southern summer evening that wrapped Maple Hollow, Tennessee in a thick blanket of heat. The seekers were loud, the air smelled like cut grass and dust, and parents sat on porch swings sipping iced tea. Emily Garrison's mother remembered that day clearly, not just because it would be the last time she saw her daughter alive, but because nothing had seemed unusual. Emily was 10 years old, freckle-faced, bright, and deeply shy. Her mom called her mouse quiet, always scribbling in her notebook, rarely the center of attention. That summer, she'd been looking forward to vacation Bible school at First Missionary Chapel, a modest whitewashed church at the edge of town. Tuesday evening was craft night. Emily had made a painted jar lantern with tissue paper and glue. Her counselor, Miss Lacey, walked her to the front steps around 7:45 p.m. Emily waved goodbye and headed off alone. On the short walk home, 4 blocks, that's all. But she never arrived. Her mother, Jean, began to worry when the sun dipped behind the ridge and Emily still hadn't returned. By 8:20, her father, Rick, was in the car, driving the streets between the church and home, flashes on, window down, calling her name. At 9:02 p.m., Jean called the Maple Hollow Police Department. Officer Dale Finley responded first. He said Jean's voice was flat with panic, like she was trying to sound calm, but couldn't stop her hands from shaking. Within an hour, patrol cars were canvassing every yard, ditch, and alleyway along Emily's route. The Garrison home filled with neighbors and church members. Flashlights lit the woods behind the subdivision. Nothing. No scream, no scuffle, no signs of a struggle, just silence. By midnight, state troopers had joined the search. The next morning, helicopters scanned the tree lines. Bloodhounds were brought in from Nashville. Emily's photo was faxed to every department in a 100-mile radius. A mobile command center was set up near the church parking lot. That's when they found it, on the second day. A Boy Scout troop assisting the search noticed something in the creek behind the old rail line, just past Cherrywood Lane. Submerged under a few inches of slow-moving water was Emily's navy blue backpack, still zipped inside her Bible school workbook, a handful of crayons, and her painted jar lantern. The candle had broken, but nothing else looked tampered with. No fingerprints, no blood, just wet paper. Detectives called the discovery concerning, but inconclusive. There was no indication of a crime, no drag marks, no torn fabric, no shoe prints. If someone had grabbed her, they'd done so surgically clean. Still, the mood in Maple Hollow shifted. Playgrounds emptied. Screen doors were locked for the first time in years. Parents stopped letting kids walk to school, even in pairs. Every white pickup truck in the county suddenly drew stares. That rumor started with Mrs. Gentry, a Sunday school teacher. She told officers she'd seen a white Ford F-150 slowly circling the block around 7:30 p.m. that night, twice. She thought it was odd, but didn't write down the plate. Said it had a cracked driver's side mirror and an old blue cooler in the back. Police put out a bolo, but no truck matching that exact description was ever found. Needs trickled in over the next few days, most of them useless. A farmer reported seeing a girl walking near the Levee Road outside town, but it turned out to be someone else's daughter. A trucker claimed he picked up a runaway near I-75, but the girl was 16 and from Chattanooga. Another witness called in from a neighboring county saying she was sure she saw Emily with a man at a gas station. It was someone's niece, no connection. One tip that briefly raised eyebrows came from a man named Reggie Collins, a known petty thief who lived in a trailer 2 miles from the creek. He was brought in for questioning after someone spotted him burning clothes in a barrel the night of the 17th. Detectives dug through the ashes. All they found were tattered jeans, a moldy flannel, and some magazine pages. Reggie's alibi that he was high and watching Wheel of Fortune with his girlfriend checked out. They had no body, no witnesses, no DNA, no crime scene, just a backpack. FBI profilers came and went. A psychological profile was built, pointing to a white male in his 202, likely familiar with the area. Possibly working a job with freedom of movement, a delivery route, maintenance crew, or construction. But the profile applied to half the men in town. The case was front-page news for a month, then 2, then less. The posters faded on telephone poles. The reward fund stalled at $27,000. The garrison stopped answering calls from reporters, and yet Jean still left the porch light on every night for 5 years. In 1996, police tried to re-engage public interest by launching Operation Lantern, a renewed push with outside agencies, psychics privately, not officially, and fresh interviews. Nothing came of it. Emily Garrison had vanished into thin air, and Maple Hollow, once a place people forgot on the map, became a town where people never forgot what was missing. But just when investigators thought they'd reached the end of every possible lead, a quiet revolution in science was already unfolding. A revolution that nearly 3 decades later would return the case to the center of national attention and finally deliver an answer no one in Maple Hollow was ready to hear. By late September 1994, 6 weeks after Emily vanished, the tone inside the Maple Hollow police station had shifted from urgent to exhausted. Detective Alana Pierce, lead investigator on the case, described the experience later as like watching fog swallow a house. The more they reached, the less there was to grab. Her whiteboard was crowded with timelines, possible sightings, and a short list of persons of interest, but nothing stuck. No forensic evidence, no credible witnesses, no suspect with motive, opportunity, and means all at once. Pierce started making house calls, quiet visits, people Emily had known, people who were near the church that night. Anyone with a window view of that 4-block walk kept showing up on the edges of her notes. Doug Rollins. Doug was 26 years old in 1994. He lived with his mother on Sycamore Street, 3 blocks from First Missionary Chapel. He worked nights at a tire shop, kept to himself, and drove at the time a white Ford pickup. On paper, he fit the vague FBI profile perfectly, and neighbors said he was off, not dangerous, just wrong. Stared too long, laughed at weird times. Kids crossed the street when he walked by. But here's the problem. Doug had an alibi. His time card showed he clocked in at the tire shop at 6:58 p.m. and didn't clock out until nearly 11. His boss confirmed it, so did a coworker. Still, Pice visited Doug's house. She described it later as claustrophobic, dark curtains, faint smell of gasoline and plastic. Doug was polite, nervous, denied even knowing who Emily was. Said he didn't attend church, didn't pay attention to kids, didn't remember what he did the day before she went missing, let alone that night. The white pickup, sold in 1995, scrapped, no records. There wasn't enough to bring him in, not then, but Pierce kept his file near the top of her drawer, just in case. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the Garrison family was quietly devastating. Jean stopped working. Rick lost 30 pounds in 3 months. Emily's room was left untouched, shoes neatly lined under the bed, a half-finished book on the nightstand, a sticker chart still hanging on the door. They installed a motion-activated light outside, even though they lived in a cul-de-sac. Jean took to walking the creek path at sunrise, retracing what she called the last known footprint. She gave 2 interviews that fall, one on America's Most Wanted and another with a local news anchor. In both, she held Emily's school photo like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. Rick didn't speak publicly. Friends said he blamed himself for letting her walk alone, even that short distance, for not being in the car 5 minutes earlier, for believing Maple Hollow was the kind of town where nothing bad ever really happened. The Garrisons' marriage didn't survive the next 2 years. By 1997, the case file had swollen to over 3,000 pages, hundreds of tips, dozens of interviews, handwritten notes from over a dozen detectives, all trying to find something, anything that had been missed. A partial fingerprint on the backpack zipper was inconclusive, too smudged. A boot print near the creek had degraded before it was cast. One strand of what might have been hair turned out to be synthetic from the lining of the backpack itself. Even the FBI began to pull back, reassigning agents to newer cases. And so, gradually, the case was shelved. Not closed, never closed, but frozen. It sat that way for over 2 decades. Every few years, a new detective would inherit it, review the evidence, reinter a witness, send off old samples to new labs with slightly better equipment. But nothing moved. Not until October 2020, when the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation began piloting a powerful new tool: familial DNA matching. Familial DNA is different from traditional forensic matching. Instead of looking for a 100% match to someone in the system, it scans for close relatives, partial matches that suggest someone related to the suspect has already submitted DNA to a law enforcement or public database. It's what solved the Golden State Killer case in California, and now it was being used in cold cases across the country. TBI analysts selected 12 cold case samples to reprocess with the new system. Emily Garrison's backpack was one of them. More specifically, the area around the backpack, soil samples and debris collected within a 5-foot radius. One evidence bag, labeled Exhibit D7, had contained a crushed aluminum beer can. It had been overlooked for years, dismissed as irrelevant, a stray piece of litter in a public creek. But in 2021, a new lab tech ran it through the system. Anyway, on July 18th, the results came back. The DNA profile extracted from the rim of the can did not match anyone in CODIS, the combined DNA index system. But the familial match did. It hit on a man in Knoxville who had submitted his DNA years earlier for a minor assault charge, and whose genetic signature pointed to a first-degree male relative who lived in Maple Hollow in the early 90s. That relative, Doug Rollins. Detective Alana Pierce was long retired by then, but when the call came in, she drove straight to the Maple Hollow station. She hadn't forgotten Doug, hadn't let go of that gut feeling. He was still in town, still living in the same house, now inherited from his late mother. Still driving a truck, not the old white Ford, but a newer Dodge. TBI agents and local detectives surveilled him for 2 weeks, collecting discarded trash, cigarette butts, a fast food cup. DNA on a straw confirmed the match. That alone wasn't enough to arrest him, not without more context, more pressure. So they brought him in for a voluntary interview, sat him under fluorescent lights, poured him a coffee, played back snippets from 1994, asked if he remembered the day Emily Garrison disappeared. Doug said little, but his hands trembled. They showed him the lab results, told him about the beer can, the DNA, the silent years. Doug stared at the wall for a long time, and then, just above a whisper, he said, "I thought it would all stay buried." What Doug revealed next would crack open everything, because Emily hadn't been taken by a stranger. She hadn't been found in the woods, because no one ever looked there. And the truth, the full truth, was even more horrifying than anyone in Maple Hollow had ever imagined. The official transcript of Doug Rollins's confession runs 42 pages. Investigators later said his tone never rose, never cracked. It was calm, flat, like he was describing something that happened to someone else. The interview began at 9:18 p.m. on the 3rd of September, 2021, in interview room 2 at the Maple Hollow Police Department. Two detectives, Special Agent Carroll from the TBI and Detective Mason Crannell, sat across from him. A small digital recorder hummed between them. At first, Doug denied everything, said the beer can wasn't his, said he didn't even drink that brand. Then they mentioned the DNA link, the one that tied him to the can found 10 feet from Emily Garrison's backpack. He stared down at his hands and muttered, "That was my spot behind the trestle." Lowe leaned forward. "What do you mean, your spot?" He shrugged. "Used to go there after work, drink a beer, cool off. Nobody bothered me." Then came the silence, 15 seconds of it. Randall later said that pause felt longer than any in his career. When Doug finally spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter. "She wasn't supposed to get scared," he said. "I just wanted to talk to her." He told them he'd left work early that night, around 7:20, said his boss had clocked him out as a favor so he could run an errand. He drove past the church, saw Emily walking, and recognized her. His mother had babysat the Garrisons years earlier, though the family hadn't realized it. He said he pulled over near the drainage ditch, offered her a ride. Emily hesitated, then refused. He followed her slowly in the butt truck, window down, saying he'd tell her parents she was rude if she didn't apologize. That's when she ran, cutting through the brush toward the creek. He followed on foot. Doug said he caught up near the trestle, grabbed her wrist, and tried to apologize, but she screamed, claimed he covered her mouth just to quiet her. When she went still, he thought she'd fainted, but minutes later, he realized she wasn't breathing. He didn't call anyone, didn't try to help, just sat there shaking with his hand still and on her shoulder. He told investigators he didn't mean to kill her, but what came next proved intent didn't matter. Doug said he carried Emily's body to the edge of the creek and hid it under an embankment, covering it with brush and stones. He waited there until almost midnight, then drove home, burned his clothes, and washed the truck bed with motor oil to mask the smell. The next morning, he went back, only to find the creek had flooded slightly overnight. The body was gone. He panicked, thinking it had washed downstream, but when he searched, he found nothing. He assumed the current had carried her farther. Investigators later determined she hadn't been washed away at all. The rise in water had loosened the soil, collapsing part of the bank and sealing her remains under nearly 2 feet of packed mud. She'd been there all along. For decades, every search party had walked within yards of that spot. The beer can discarded nearby was what eventually betrayed him. Lowe asked why he never came forward. Doug rubbed his face and said, "I thought God already knew. I figured that was enough." When pressed further, he admitted that he'd watched the news coverage for months afterward, terrified someone would find her. He said he even joined one of the volunteer search groups, walking side by side with Jean Garrison for nearly an hour. "She thanked me for helping," he said. "That's when I knew I couldn't ever tell her." Detectives later described that as the moment the room went still. The confession gave them probable cause for a warrant, but they still needed proof of body, physical evidence that corroborated his story. Doug agreed to take them there. The next morning, escorted by officers and crime scene texts, he was driven in cuffs to the old rail trestle behind Cherrywood Lane. The area was overgrown, wild with kudzu and thorn bushes. Doug guided them to a bend in the creek and pointed. "There," he said. "Right, he under that cedar." Excavation began slowly, layer by layer. By afternoon, they uncovered fragments of fabric, bone, and what appeared to be a child's sneaker sole, still faintly blue beneath the mud. DNA testing later confirmed the remains were Emily Garrison's. After 27 years, she'd finally been found, less than 300 yards from where her backpack had surfaced. News of the discovery broke within hours. Maple Hollow, quiet for decades, was suddenly flooded with reporters. Satellite vans lined Main Street, microphones poked through chain-link fences. Jean Garrison, now 58, declined all interviews. She issued a short statement. "We prayed for answers, not miracles. We're grateful for both." Rick Garrison, remarried and living 2 counties away, attended the press conference but didn't speak. He wept openly when the sheriff confirmed Emily's remains had been positively identified. For the first time, Maple Hollow had a name, and yet closure felt like a cruel word. Doug Rollins was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. The district attorney announced they'd seek life without parole. When asked why Doug had never been a stronger suspect back then, Detective Pierce, brought out of retirement for the press briefing, answered carefully. Because in 1994, we didn't have what we have now, and sometimes evil hides behind the ordinary. During arraignment, Doug showed no emotion, no tears, no apology. He simply stared at the floor while the judge read the charges. Behind him, Jean sat clutching Emily's photo, the same one she'd held on America's Most Wanted, the one she'd carried for 27 years. But the confession didn't explain everything. When agents searched Doug's house, they found a small, locked box hidden in the crawl space. Inside were dozens of photographs, most of them mundane shots of creeks, roads, and fields around Maple Hollow. But mixed among them were pictures of young girls, some playing in yards, some walking home from school, all taken from a distance. None appeared harmed, but all were dated. Everyone between 1992 and 1996. Doug had been watching children for years. The FBI launched a review to determine whether other disappearances in the region might be connected. So far, none have been publicly confirmed. Still, the discovery changed the tone of the case. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about what Maple Hollow almost became a hunting ground, hiding in plain sight. Doug Rollins eventually took a plea deal in exchange for waiving appeals. Life in prison, no parole. He's currently housed at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. During sentencing, he made a brief statement. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even forgive myself. I just want it quiet now." Jean Garrison, in her victim impact speech, replied, "Quiet is what you took from us. We lived 27 years listening for her voice, and now that we found her, well, never stop speaking her name." The courtroom fell silent, but even then, not every mystery was resolved, because buried within Doug's confession was one small, chilling inconsistency, something investigators couldn't explain, a detail that didn't match the physical evidence. And that discrepancy would spark a final investigation, one that uncovered a truth Maple Hollow had missed for nearly 3 decades. In the immediate aftermath of Doug Rollins' confession, TBI agents and Maple Hollow detectives considered the case closed. The timeline aligned, the location matched, the physical evidence corroborated nearly every detail. But one
small inconsistency nagged at Special Agent Carollo. It was a single sentence buried in the middle of Doug's statement. "She dropped the jar when I grabbed her. It rolled down toward the water. At first, no one thought much of it. But Lowe had studied the evidence photos from 1994. Emily's painted jar lantern, the one she'd made at Vacation Bible School, had been found inside her backpack, intact, minus the broken candle. If Doug had chased her, grabbed her, and she dropped the jar before being killed, how did it end up zipped into her backpack afterward? Lowe flagged it quietly. Detective Randall dismissed it as trauma-related confusion. He probably misremembered. "It's been 27 years, he said. Details shift." But Lowe couldn't let it go. She pulled the full evidence log, the original chain of custody forms from August 1994. And what she found was odd. The backpack had been cataloged by Officer Dale Finlay on site at the creek, but the jar wasn't listed in the first report. It only appears in the second, after the backpack had already been transported to evidence lockup, meaning either the jar had been missed in the field or it wasn't in the backpack when it was found. That's when a disturbing possibility crept in. What if Doug hadn't acted alone? Lowe took it to her supervisor at TBI. At first, she was told to drop it. The confession was clean, they had a conviction, and the community had closure. But she persisted. She went back through every witness statement from 1994, looking for discrepancies, cross-referencing times, addresses, anything that might hint at another person involved. One name caught her attention: Raymond Ray Elkins. He was 20 years old in 1994, a friend of Doug's from high school. The two had worked briefly together on a landscaping crew. A neighbor recalled seeing them drinking behind the old trestle more than once that summer. Rye had never been interviewed in the original investigation. When Lowe ran his name, she found he'd moved to Kentucky in 1997, had a DUI in 2003, but nothing serious. He now worked in home renovation near Bowling Green. She decided to drive up. Ray Elkins lived alone in the small rental house off a gravel road. His yard was overgrown, the porch littered with tools and beer cans. When Lowe arrived, he seemed nervous but cooperative. He denied knowing anything about Emily's case, claimed he hadn't spoken to Doug in 20 years, said he barely remembered that summer. But when Lowe casually mentioned the painted jar, the one detail Doug got wrong, Ray froze. "Wait," he said. "The jar that was hers." Lowe didn't answer. She just stared at him. Rye backtracked, tried to change the subject, claimed he must have seen it on the news. But Lowe hadn't mentioned the jar publicly. No one had. It was time to dig deeper. Back in Maple Hollow, Lowe pulled every record she could find on Ray Elkins. Old school yearbooks, minor court filings, even photographs from the 1994 VBS sessions donated by parents. In one photo taken outside the church on the final day, Ray Elkins is visible in the background, leaning against his truck, smoking, watching the children. It placed him at the scene. The next step was risky, a knock-and-talk interview with backup standing by. Lowe returned to Bowling Green with 2 officers from the Kentucky State Police. Ray let them in, nervous but calm. Then Lowe showed him the photo, asked if he remembered being there. Ray stared at it for a long moment. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "I didn't know she died that night. It was the break she needed." Ray's second interview was recorded. He didn't admit to the abduction, but he confirmed something that changed everything. He had been with Doug that night. According to Ray, they'd planned to drink at the trestle, same as always. Doug showed up late, said he'd messed up bad, brought a backpack with him, panicked, shaking. Ray said Doug confessed to grabbing the Garrison girl and scaring her too much. Ray claimed he never saw a body, that Doug asked him to help get rid of something, but he refused. But here's the catch. Ray did admit to and touching the backpack. He said Doug threw it at him and told him to dump it in the creek, that he walked a few yards downstream and tossed it in without opening it, which means Ray's fingerprints may have been on the bag and the jar. It could have been placed inside after the fact. Suddenly the sequence of events shifted. Doug may have killed Emily, but Ray helped cover it up, and for 27 years he'd kept silent. With the new testimony, prosecutors reopened the case file. Ray Elkins was arrested for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory after the fact to murder. His plea deal required full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. During court proceedings, he admitted to helping Doug wash out the truck bed days later and burning what Doug described as clothes from that night. Ray claimed he didn't know the extent of what had happened, said Doug told him it was an accident, but the jury didn't buy it. He was sentenced to 9 years in a medium security facility with eligibility for parole in 4. When asked why he never came forward, Ray replied, "Because I was afraid I'd go to prison, and because I didn't want to believe he'd really killed that girl." The discovery of Ray's role sent fresh shockwaves through Maple Hollow. News outlets returned, old wounds reopened. For the Garrison family, it was like losing Emily again. Jean Garrison made a second final statement to the press. "We waited 27 years for the truth, and even now, we don't have all of it. But we know more than we did, and that matters." She declined all further interviews. In the end, it wasn't one man hiding a secret for nearly 3 decades. It was 2. One, a killer who chose silence over redemption. The other, a coward who convinced himself it wasn't his problem. But together, they built a lie strong enough to bury a child beneath a small-town creek for 27 years. And it was only when both cracks surfaced, one through science, the other through guilt, that Maple Hollow could finally exhale. Almost. Because there was still one final piece of evidence no one could explain. Something was found during the excavation near Emily's remains, something that didn't belong to either man. And that final clue would raise one last chilling question. During the excavation that recovered Emily Garrison's remains, forensic teams documented every item removed from the soil. Cloth fragments, hair fibers, skeletal material. But one object stood out, an anomaly that didn't belong to a child and didn't appear in Doug Rollins's confession or Ray Elkins's testimony. It was found lodged in the compacted sediment just 2 feet from Emily's shallow grave. A small brass key corroded. No tags, no markings beyond a faint triangle stamped into the bow. At first, Tex assumed it belonged to Emily. Maybe a house key, something she wore on a chain. But Jean Garrison was adamant. Emily never had a key. We didn't give her one until she turned 12. She was only 10. More curious, the key didn't match any locks in the Garrison home, Doug Rollins's truck, or any buildings associated with Ray Elkins. So, where had it come from? Special Agent Carol Lowe ordered the key scanned, photographed, and sent to the TBI for metallurgy analysis. The results were subtle but telling. The key had been manufactured sometime between 1985 and 1993, most likely for a filing cabinet or personal lockbox, not a residential door. The triangle marking, it turned out, to be a model identifier from a now-defunct company called Franklin Caseworks, which produced portable document safes and keyed lockboxes used in home offices. That detail changed everything. If the key wasn't Emily's, and it wasn't Doug's or Ray's, then someone else had been there. Lowe quietly reopened the physical evidence inventory from the scene. She combed through the report from 1994, line by line, looking for anything that could be connected to a lockbox. That's when she noticed something strange. A line added by hand, not typed like the rest. Found near South Bend, approximate 15 meters downstream. Rusted padlock casing. Possibly unrelated, the note had been made by Officer Dale Finley, the same patrolman who found Emily's backpack in 1994. It hadn't seemed important. A rusted padlock in the woods, probably discarded trash. No connection had ever been made to the case. But now, with the discovery of the matching key, Lowe felt a cold unease settle in. She reached out to Finley, now retired and living in Cookville. When asked about the padlock, Finley chuckled grimly. Hell, if I remember, probably tossed it after the rains came. It was gone, discarded, a clue lost to time. But something about that padlock and the key found beside Emily's grave refused to let go of Lowe's mind. She ordered a fresh scan of all related case evidence from 1994, especially those logged under miscellaneous items. In one photo from the original evidence table, she spotted something barely visible in the frame. A plastic handle with a broken hinge. A black molded casing shattered at the corner. Zoomed in, the faint outline of a triangle was visible near the edge. It wasn't labeled in the report. It had never been tagged. But it was there, clear as day. A portable document lockbox. The same model Franklin Caseworks had produced in the early 90s. Lowe had her answer. Someone had buried that key near Emily's body. Because they'd been there with that lockbox. But the real question was, why? In interviews, Doug Rollins never mentioned a lockbox, never referred to hiding anything. And Ray Elkins, when confronted with the photo, looked genuinely confused. I swear to God, I never saw that. If he had it, he never showed me. So who brought it? Lowe went back to the creek site. The recovered key, now cleaned, was tested for prints. None. But in the soil around, and its forensic teams had collected particulates, trace pollen, root fibers, and a surprising amount of ash. It took weeks to isolate, but the final report showed that the ash near Emily's body wasn't from burned brush or leaves. It was processed wood particle board, the kind used to manufacture office furniture. And it matched the inner composition of Franklin Caseworks' lockboxes. In short, the box had been burned at the scene, possibly destroyed after being emptied. That raised an even darker question. What had been inside it? Lowe compiled a short list of locals from 1994 who fit key criteria. Lived near the creek, had access to Doug Rollins or Ray Elkins, worked in administration, records, or law enforcement, owned or might have owned a lockbox. She landed on 4 names. 3 were quickly ruled out. The 4th was Deputy Arnold Hensley, retired in 2008. He'd been a part-time deputy with Maple Hollow PD in the 1990s, helped with canvassing during Emily's initial disappearance, ran point on volunteer coordination, handled tip logs and task force assignments. In short, he had full access to the investigation, and no one ever questioned his presence. Lowe looked up his personnel file. TBI records showed he had faced an internal complaint in 1996, inappropriate contact with a juvenile witness during an unrelated burglary investigation. The complaint was dropped, no charges filed. But the timing was disturbing, and so was his connection to Doug Rollins, because in a witness statement from 1994, buried in the case files, Doug's mother casually mentioned that Arnold stops by the house sometimes, checks on Doug when he's off work. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough for a warrant. On the 18th of April, 2022, TBI agents served a search warrant on Arnold Hensley's home, a 2-story ranch near Norris Lake. They seized multiple items: an old duty belt, a destroyed hard drive, and 3 handwritten notebooks. The most disturbing find, it came from his attic. Behind insulation and under loose boards, they discovered a rusted metal hinge and latch, the same type
Used on Franklin Caseworks lockboxes.
and in the corner, a burned patch of flooring blackened with ash. The forensics weren't conclusive, but the implication was clear. Hensley had possessed a lockbox, and he'd gone to great lengths to destroy it. Faced with mounting pressure, Hensley refused to speak. His lawyer released a statement denying any involvement. No charges have been filed to this day, but investigators believe that in the days following Emily's disappearance, something changed. That Doug Rollins didn't act alone. Or if he did, someone exploited that chaos to hide something else at the same site. The key, the ash, the lockbox. They don't just point to murder, they point to cover-up. To this day, the final contents of that burned lockbox remain a mystery, but the implications haunt everyone involved. Was Emily in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did someone, maybe more than one person, decide her disappearance was a convenient place to bury a much darker secret? The town of Maple Hollow may never know, but what they do know is this: Emily Garrison's name is no longer a question. It's an answer, and every answer has weight. On a rainy Friday morning in September 2022, the town of Maple Hollow gathered outside First Missionary Chapel for a memorial service nearly 3 decades overdue. Emily Garrison's remains had finally come home. Her casket was small, white, carried by 2 cousins, a family friend, and the deputy who first responded that night in 1994, Dale Finley. He retired long ago, but when asked to help carry Emily to her final resting place, he said, "Asterisk, I've carried the weight of that night my whole life. I owe her this." Jean Garrison didn't speak at the service. She sat in the front row, surrounded by photos of Emily, the missing teeth, the birthday cake, the first communion dress. Rick sat a few rows back with his new family. They nodded to each other, but didn't speak. There was no sermon, no eulogy, just a reading of Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." It was over in under 30 minutes, but the echoes of that moment of closure, too late and too thin, would linger far longer. In the weeks after the burial, the town tried to move on. The headlines faded, the news vans left, but for many, the story refused to settle, especially for Kara Lowe. Despite the successful prosecution of Doug Rollins and the conviction of Ray Elkins for obstruction, one thing remained unresolved: the key, the lockbox, the burned attic. She filed a supplemental report recommending a grand jury review of Deputy Arnold Hensley's potential involvement. But without new evidence or a confession, the district attorney declined to pursue charges. "We have to prosecute the case we can prove," he said, "not the one we suspect." But suspicion remained. Because Hensley wasn't just a deputy in 1994, he was one of the first responders to the creek site when the backpack was found. He helped coordinate the search. He had access to evidence logs, He had a relationship with Doug's mother, and more disturbingly, according to a newly surfaced 1995 personnel memo, he had borrowed a Franklin Caseworks lockbox from the department's record room and never returned it. That lockbox was never officially logged again. A new theory began to circulate within law enforcement circles, quietly and unofficially, that Doug Rollins may have acted on impulse, but someone else had used the chaos of Emily's disappearance to bury a separate secret. That the lockbox may have contained documents, photos, or information unrelated to Emily's death, but damning in another way. That it was buried during the window of panic and community distraction, sealed with a key never meant to be found. And when the creek rose and the embankment shifted, the key surfaced. An accident, a glitch, and a cover-up that almost worked. Jean Garrison has never commented on the lockbox. Privately, she told one journalist, asterisk, "I don't want to know more horror than I already do. Emily was lost. She was alone. That's enough pain for one lifetime." But some in town whisper that she does want the rest of the truth, and that she's working quietly through lawyers to force the case back into review. The problem is time. Records are gone. Witnesses have died or forgotten, and Hensley, now in his 72nd, has retreated from public life. He lives alone, rarely seen, never speaks to press or former colleagues, but his silence only deepens the mystery. In 2023, Emily Garrison's name was added to the National Cold Case Registry's list of partially resolved homicides, not because the killer wasn't found, but because the entire truth still isn't. Her case now appears in training seminars across the country, used by the FBI and state agencies to illustrate the power of familial DNA, the danger of tunnel vision in investigations, and the haunting reality that even solved cases can contain secrets that never fully come to light. One agent described it like this: imagine closing a book only to realize the last page is glued shut. You know how it ends, but part of you still wonders what you're not supposed to read. As for Doug Rollins, he remains at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. He does not speak to media. He has received no visitors since his sentencing. In one final psychological evaluation, a therapist noted Doug exhibited low affect, shallow remorse, and compartmentalization, typical of disassociated offenders. When asked if he ever thought about Emily, he answered, "Only when I dream. But in the dreams, she walks away, and I wake up before she turns around." Ray Elkins was paroled in September 2025 after serving nearly 4 years. He moved out of state under a new identity. His exact whereabouts are unknown. His final statement to the court during release: "I was a coward. I chose myself, and I'll carry that choice until the day I die." In Maple Hollow, a memorial bench now sits beside the creek, not far from where Emily was found. Etched into the wood are the words, "She walked home alone, but she is never alone again." People leave flowers, painted jars, children's drawings, and sandwich bags. Every August 16th, Jean visits before sunrise and lights a candle. And for a few minutes, the air holds still like the town is listening. Emily Garrison was not forgotten. She was failed by time, by silence, by the systems meant to protect her. And though her story ends in answers, it also ends in echoes.